The night Dean Martin finally agreed to return to Memphis, the air felt heavier than memory alone could explain. It had been years since he had spoken Elvis's name out loud. Not because he had forgotten him, Dean never forgot anything that mattered, but because some names carried weight, and some carried grief. Elvis Presley carried both. The world had moved on in its loud, careless way, turning a man into a legend and a legend into a caricature. But Dean had known the man beneath the rhinestones and the headlines. He had known the laugh that came to isolate, the loneliness that came too often, and the silence that followed him everywhere, even in crowded rooms. When Elvis died in 1977, Dean had been on a studio lot in Los Angeles. Someone had told him between takes, quietly, as if afraid the news itself might shatter something fragile in the air. Dean hadn't cried, not then. He had gone home, poured a drink he didn't finish, and sat alone until dawn, staring at nothing in particular, listening to the echo of a voice that once filled rooms without trying now. Decades later, that echo had returned not as sound, but as a question. The letter had arrived without warning. No return address, just his name, written in careful, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, a single sentence rested on thick, yellowed paper. There are things in the basement that were never meant to be buried. No signatures. No explanations. Dean had laughed when he first read it. A short, dismissive sound. People had been inventing myths about Elvis since the day he died. Sightings, rumors, stories that refused to let go. Dean had never indulged them. He believed in truth, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. But something about the letter stayed with him, not the words themselves, but the restraint. Whoever wrote it wasn't trying to convince him of anything. There were no grand claims, no promises of revelation, just a quiet suggestion. Almost respectful, almost personal, Graceland had become something else after Elvis's death. A shrine, a destination. A place where grief was packaged and sold in postcards and souvenir mugs. Dean had avoided it intentionally. Some places deserved to remain untouched in memory. Yet here he was. Years later, standing at the gates, the Tennessee sky low and gray above him, the mansion looked smaller than he remembered. Or maybe memory had exaggerated it. Fame had a way of doing that, stretching moments, enlarging rooms, turning ordinary walls into monuments. The white columns still stood, proud but tired, like they too had been holding their breath for decades. Dean wasn't greeted by fans or cameras. The visit had been arranged quietly, official, controlled. A favor granted to a friend of a friend. Time had softened a lot of doors. Inside, Graceland smelled the same. Old wood, faint polish, something sweet and stale beneath it all. Like a house that remembered laughter but hadn't heard it in a long time. He walked slowly, his steps measured, respectful. Each room felt like a held note unfinished, unresolved. Elvis's presence wasn't loud here. It was subtle. A jacket draped just so. A piano bench pushed back an inch too far, as if someone had stood up suddenly and never returned. Dean paused in the music room longer than he expected. He remembered Elvis there. Not performing. Not entertaining. Just sitting, tapping his fingers against the keys without playing, humming softly to himself, chasing something he could never quite catch. Fame had given Elvis everything except peace. And Dean had recognized that hunger because he had carried it himself, though in quieter ways. A staff member cleared his throat gently behind him. The basement, the man said. Whenever you're ready. Dean nodded. The stairs down were narrow. The light dimmed with each step. This wasn't the part of Graceland the world saw. No velvet ropes. No guided tour chatter. Just concrete, shelves, storage rooms filled with boxes labeled in fading ink. Years of accumulation. Years of silence. They stopped at a locked door. This section was sealed off years ago, the staff member explained. Mostly old recordings. Personal items. Things the family never wanted displayed. Dean felt something tighten in his chest. Why now? He asked quietly. The man hesitated. Because some things don't stay quiet forever. The door opened with a reluctant creak. Inside, the room was colder. Smaller than Dean expected. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with reels of tape, notebooks, envelopes, and old recording equipment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just evidence of work. Of process. Of a man who never stopped creating, even when the world thought it knew him completely. Dean walked in slowly. One box, placed deliberately on a central table, drew his attention immediately. Unlike the others, it was clean. Untouched by dust, a handwritten label rested on top. Not for the public. Dean reached out, then stopped himself. His hand hovered in the air. He hadn't felt this kind of hesitation in years. This wasn't curiosity. It was responsibility. "What's in it?" he asked. The staff member swallowed. Recordings, notes, conversations, some with names you'd recognize, some you wouldn't. Dean exhaled slowly. Elvis had always been misunderstood, not because people didn't talk about him, because they talked over him. They filled the silence with stories that suited them. Maybe that's what this was. Not proof of survival. Not a resurrection of myth. But the truth, people never waited long enough to hear. Dean opened the box. Inside were tapes. Dozens of them. Carefully labeled. Dates, times, titles, written in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting, rounded letters. Uneven pressure. As if he wrote while thinking faster than his hand could move. One tape sat apart from the rest. No date, no title. Just 2 words. For Dean. The room seemed to contract around him. Dean picked it up. His fingers trembling despite himself. He hadn't expected this. I hadn't prepared for it. His name, written by a man who had been gone for decades, stared back at him like a message caught between worlds. This... Dean's voice faltered. He cleared his throat. This wasn't supposed to be here. The staff member shook his head. It was hidden, intentionally. We only found it during renovations last year. Dean sat down slowly. The weight of the tape heavier than any award he'd ever held. For the first time since 1977. He felt something shift, not disbelief, not denial, but recognition. Elvis hadn't been trying to escape the world. He had been trying to explain himself to it. And when the world didn't listen, he had left his voice behind instead. Dean stared at the tape, understanding now that whatever was on it wasn't about death. It was about truth. And truth, he knew, had a way of outliving everyone. The basement was silent again, but the silence was no longer empty. Dean didn't play the tape right away. He sat there for a long time, the cassette resting in his hands as if it were something fragile, something that could shatter if rushed. The room felt colder now. Or maybe that was just his imagination reacting to the weight of memory pressing in from every side. He had learned long ago that some moments demanded patience, not curiosity. Elvis had always been that way. He never said the important things immediately. He circled them, joked around them, sang around them until suddenly, without warning, he would say something that stayed with you for the rest of your life. Dean rose slowly and asked to be left alone. The staff member hesitated, and nodded and closed the door behind him. The click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. Dean was alone now, not just in the room, but with the past itself. He found an old tape player on the shelf nearby. It was heavy, industrial, the kind built to last, not to impress. Dean tested it gently, rewound the cassette with care, and sat back down. His heart beat harder than he expected. This wasn't nostalgia. This was confrontation. He pressed play at first. There was nothing but static. A low hiss filled the room, uneven and restless like breathing. Dean leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He had listened to enough recordings in his life to know that silence at the beginning meant intention. Someone had waited before speaking, then a voice emerged, not singing, not performing, just talking. Low, slow, tired. Dean, if you're hearing this, it means I finally did one thing right. Dean closed his eyes. The voice was older than the Elvis the world remembered, rougher, less polished. The accent softened by exhaustion rather than fame. This was not the voice of a king. It was the voice of a man who had spent too long being listened to and not long enough being heard. "I don't know when you'll hear it," the voice continued, "or who let you down there. But I know you'll understand why I didn't say all this out loud." Dean's chest tightened. He hadn't expected directness. Elvis had rarely been direct when it mattered most. "I tried," the voice said. "Lord knows I tried. To explain myself, to slow it all down. But once you become a symbol, people don't want the man anymore. They want the story they already bought." Dean exhaled through his nose, slowly, carefully. He could feel it now, the same exhaustion he'd carried quietly through his own career. The difference was that Dean had learned how to step away. Elvis never had. The tape clicked softly as it continued. "There's a lot of noise out there about me. About who I was. About what happened. And I'm telling you right now, most of it ain't truth. But it ain't lies either. It's something worse. It's people filling in silence they didn't earn." Dean opened his eyes and stared at the concrete floor. Elvis wasn't confessing to anything. He wasn't correcting rumors. He wasn't trying to shock. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was reclaiming his own narrative. "I started recording because I knew someday I wouldn't be able to talk," the voice said quietly. "Not because I was dying. Because I was disappearing." That sentence landed like a weight. Dean felt a memory surface uninvited. Elvis sitting backstage once, head down, fingers twisting a ring around and around, saying softly, "They clap, but they don't look at me." Dean had brushed it off then. Told him he was tired, told him he was overthinking. He wished now that he had listened better. The tape hissed again, then resumed. "I hid these down here because I didn't trust the world with them. Fame teaches you that timing matters more than truth, and the truth too early is just another kind of lie." Dean swallowed. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He could almost see Elvis sitting somewhere unseen, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, choosing his words carefully, not for effect, but for survival. "I'm not asking you to defend me," the voice said, "and I sure as hell don't want to be resurrected by strangers who never knew me. But if there ever comes a time when my name gets louder than my voice, I want you to decide what stays buried." Dean's hand tightened around the edge of the table. This wasn't about secrets. It was about trust. The recording continued for nearly an hour. Elvis spoke about loneliness not in dramatic terms, but in practical ones. Empty hotel rooms. Conversations that never went anywhere. Doctors who talked at him instead of to him. People who needed him alive but couldn't stand him human. He spoke about music too, unfinished songs. Melodies that scared him because they felt too honest. Lyrics he'd never recorded because they didn't fit the image. "They told me the people don't want sad," Elvis said softly. "But sad is where the truth sits." Dean felt tears sting his eyes and didn't fight them. Near the end of the tape, Elvis's voice slowed. "Not weak or just resolved. I know what'll happen when I'm gone," he said. "They'll build a story that makes sense to them. And that's fine. People need endings. But you and I both know some lives don't end clean." The tape clicked. Silence filled the room again. Dean didn't move. For a long time, he simply sat there listening to nothing, letting the weight of what he'd heard settle where it needed to. Elvis hadn't left behind proof of survival. He had left behind proof of presence, evidence that the man never vanished. Even when the world stopped asking real questions, Dean finally stood and looked around the room. The other boxes suddenly felt different. Not artifacts, responsibilities. Someone had hidden these recordings not to deceive the world but to protect a truth too delicate for spectacle, Dean understood. Now why his name had been on that tape. It wasn't about revealing something shocking. It was about deciding whether the world deserved something honest as he rewound the cassette and placed it carefully back in its box. Dean felt the shift again, not disbelief, not fear, but purpose. Some stories weren't meant to stay buried, and some truths didn't need its headlines to be powerful. He turned off the light and closed the door behind him above ground. The world still believed it knew Elvis Presley, but below Graceland, the man had finally been heard. Dean Martin didn't sleep that night. He stayed at a quiet hotel on the edge of Memphis. The kind of place built for passing through rather than staying. The curtains were heavy, the room dim, even with the lights on, but none of that mattered. The voice from the basement followed him, not loudly, not insistently, but patiently. It didn't demand action. It waited. Dean sat at the small desk by the window, a glass of water untouched beside him, staring at the city lights as if they might answer a question he hadn't yet fully formed. He had spent a lifetime learning how to leave things unsaid. It was how you survived in a world that turned vulnerability into currency. But this felt different. This wasn't restraint. It was deferral. And deferral, he knew, had consequences. What Elvis had left behind wasn't explosive. It wasn't scandal. That was what made it dangerous. It was honest. By morning, Dean understood something with unsettling clarity. The recordings were not meant to change how the world remembered Elvis. They were meant to correct how the world used him. He returned to Graceland before it opened to the public. The mansion was quiet in a way it never was once the gates opened. No footsteps. No murmurs. No reverent whispers echoing off polished floors. Just the house itself, aging with dignity, holding more than it showed. Dean asked for access again. This time, the hesitation was longer. "There are concerns," the estate representative said carefully, folding her hands as if to keep them still. She was younger than Dean expected, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who'd learned early how to manage other people's legacies. Those recordings were never cataloged. They weren't cleared. And there are people who believe they were hidden for a reason. Dean nodded. Everything's hidden for a reason. Doesn't mean it's supposed to stay that way. She studied him. Not skeptically, thoughtfully. "You understand," she said, "that once something like this is acknowledged, it doesn't belong to anyone anymore." Dean gave a faint smile. That's always been the risk with truth. They let him in. The basement felt different, not colder, but charged, as if it knew it had been noticed. Dean moved slowly among the shelves, selecting tapes at random, resisting the urge to search for anything specific. Elvis hadn't recorded these to be curated. They were fragments, thoughts, unfinished sentences that only made sense when you stopped trying to assemble them into a headline. One tape stood out immediately. It wasn't labeled with a date or a name, just a word written in bold, uneven letters, ENOUGH, then hesitated. Then he pressed play. This recording was different from the first. The voice was sharper, more alert, less weary. Elvis wasn't confiding now. He was confronting. "I don't want to be preserved," the voice said plainly. "I want to be understood." Dean leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath him. "They keep asking me to repeat myself," Elvis continued. "Same songs, same stories, the same version of me that makes everybody comfortable. But comfort isn't truth. It's just quiet." The tape cut briefly, then resumed. "I know how this ends," Elvis said. "Not the dying part, the remembering part. They'll smooth me out, sand down the edges, turn me into something safe enough to sell forever." Dean felt a familiar bitterness rise in his chest. He had watched it happen to others. He had watched it nearly happen to himself. And maybe that's fine for them. Elvis went on. "But it ain't fine for me." There it was, not anger, not resentment, boundaries. The tape ended abruptly, as if Elvis had stopped recording the moment he said what mattered most. Dean sat in silence, absorbing the weight of that single word enough. It wasn't rebellion. It was exhaustion drawing a line. Later that afternoon, Dean was asked to meet with representatives tied to the estate lawyers, archivists, people whose livelihoods depended on maintaining balance between memory and market. The meeting took place in a room filled with framed photographs. Elvis smiling, Elvis performing, Elvis frozen in moments the world found acceptable. Dean stood near the window while they spoke. "These materials," one man said carefully, "were never intended for release. There's no instruction. No consent." Dean turned to face them. "There's intent. That's clearer than consent ever is," another voice, quieter, added. "But what would the public gain?" Dean considered the question. They'd gain a pause, he said finally. A moment where they don't get to project themselves onto him. The room fell quiet. One woman sighed softly. You know how this will be twisted? Yes, Dean replied. And I also know what happens when it isn't said at all. That night, back at the hotel, Dean listened to the first tape, again the one labeled for Dean. This time, something stood out that he hadn't noticed before. Near the end, Elvis had said something almost casually, as if afraid to linger on it. Truth doesn't need defending, the voice had said. It just needs time. Dean realized then that the tapes weren't instructions. They were trust. Elvis hadn't asked Dean to reveal everything. He had asked him to choose carefully, and that choice was heavier than any decision Dean had ever made on a stage. He could walk away. Let the recordings remain buried, protected from misinterpretation, preserved in silence. The world would continue exactly as it had, loud, confident. Wrong in familiar ways, or he could allow a fragment of truth to surface. Not as spectacle, not as revelation, but as context. Dean stood by the window. Watching dawn creep over the city, he understood now that this wasn't about Elvis at all. It was about whether the world was capable of listening without consuming, and whether silence, at this point, was still an act of respect or simply another form of convenience. Dean picked up the phone. There was one more conversation that needed to happen, and it would change everything. Dean Martin chose the smallest room he could find. Not a studio, not a stage, not a press hall designed for echoes and applause. Just a modest listening room inside a public archive in Los Angeles' neutral ground, intentionally unremarkable. There were no banners outside, no advance rumors circulating through the industry. Only a quiet notice placed days earlier. Easy to overlook. Unless you were paying attention. An unpublished archival recording will be played. Attendance limited. That was all it said. Dean arrived early, wearing no jacket, no tie, nothing that announced who he was. Age had given him that privilege. He no longer needed recognition to be present. He sat in the back row while technicians tested sound levels with professional indifference, unaware that the man watching them had once filled rooms 10 times this size without effort. He had spent the previous week in careful conversation lawyers, archivists, historians. No media representatives were invited. No live broadcast was permitted. This wasn't an unveiling. It was an offering. Dean hadn't released everything. He never planned to. The world didn't need every thought Elvis ever recorded. That would have turned honesty into inventory. Instead, Dean chose one fragment titled, Unadorned, Unmistakably Human, a voice without armor. As people filtered in, Dean studied them quietly. They weren't fans in costume. They weren't thrill-seekers hoping for myth. They were musicians, writers, scholars, people who understood that history was shaped as much by omission as by fact. When the room settled, Dean stood. No introduction was made. He walked to the podium slowly, resting his hands against its edges, feeling the smooth wood beneath his palms. He looked out at the room, not searching for faces, not seeking approval, just making sure the silence was ready. I'm not here to tell you a secret, Dean said calmly, and I'm not here to correct a story you already believe. A few people leaned forward. I'm here because someone trusted me with something unfinished. He paused. For years, we've talked about a man without letting him speak. We've argued about him, claimed him, explained him away. Tonight isn't about changing any of that. Dean glanced back toward the technicians. It's about letting one voice exist without interruption. Stepped aside. The lights dimmed out dramatically, just enough to signal attention. The room became still in a way Dean recognized immediately. This wasn't anticipation. It was respect. The recording began. Elvis's voice filled the room, softer than anyone expected. Not commanding. Not polished. It didn't reach out and grab the listener. It waited. I don't mind being remembered, the voice said. I just don't want to be reduced. No one moved. I was loud on stage because that's where people needed me loud. Off stage, I needed quiet, and I didn't get much of it. Dean felt the weight of those words settle into the room, unchallenged. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Elvis continued. I'm not asking for understanding. I'm just asking for room. Room to be complicated. Room to be tired. Room to not be a symbol every second I breathe. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. The recording went on, not long, not dramatic. Elvis spoke about music as refuge, about the danger of being loved for an image instead of a self. He didn't accuse, he didn't defend. He reflected near the end. His voice grew quieter, not weaker, but certain. If this ever gets heard, Elvis said, I hope it's in a place where nobody's trying to turn it into something bigger than it is. The tape clicked. Silence returned. It lasted longer than any applause ever could. No one clapped. No one spoke. People sat with the sound of a man finally allowed to exist without translation. Dean remained where he was, hands folded loosely in front of him. After a time, someone stood not to ask a question, but simply to nod once, slowly. In thanks, that was enough. The room emptied gradually, respectfully. No rush for exits. No chatter. The silence followed them out, intact. Dean stayed behind. A young archivist approached him cautiously. Was that all of it? Dean smiled faintly. It was what needed to be heard. What happens to the rest? She asked. Dean looked toward the darkened speakers. They stay where they are, he said. Not hidden. Just not used. Later that night, alone in his car, Dean allowed himself a moment he hadn't anticipated. Relief, not because the burden was gone, but because it was shared without being exploited. He thought of the basement at Graceland, the tapes still resting on shelves, safe, undisturbed, not forgotten. But respected Elvis hadn't been asking to be resurrected. He had been asking not to be overwritten. As Dean drove into the quiet, he understood something with gentle certainty. Legacies weren't preserved by noise. They were preserved by restraint. By knowing when to speak and when to stop, the world would continue to speculate. It always would. But now, somewhere beneath the stories, there was a voice that had been heard exactly once. Exactly as intended. And that was enough. Dean turned onto the empty road, the city lights fading behind him, carrying with him the rare peace of having done something true without making it loud. Some truths didn't need proof. They just needed permission.